Two soldiers face life and death on the battlefield. But what happens when one must choose between saving a friend or an enemy? This shocking act of courage will leave you questioning everything. Stay with us to see the unbelievable twist that changes both their lives forever. The air was thick with the sounds of gunfire and distant explosions. Dust swirled in the wind, carrying the acrid smell of smoke and sweat. Jackson, a soldier in the 82nd Airborne Division, wiped the grime from his forehead as he crouched low behind a half-destroyed wall. His pulse raced, but his breath remained steady. He had trained for this, survived worse. His sharp eyes scanned the battlefield, always alert, always ready. As the sound of footsteps approached from behind, Jackson turned to see his squadmate, Chris, staggering toward him. Blood streaked down Chris's leg, his face twisted in pain. Jackson's immediate instinct was to reach for him, but he hesitated. Chris was the kind of man who, just a few months earlier, would have never wanted to be touched by someone like Jackson. They'd shared a unit, sure, but not a bond. "Jackson," Chris gasped, collapsing beside him, his voice hoarse from shouting over the chaos. "Help me. I can't." Jackson's eyes narrowed as he stared at Chris's face, now pale from blood loss. He could hear the echo of Chris's voice from past conversations, casual, cutting remarks about Jackson's skin, his background, his very presence in the unit. It wasn't just Chris either. The whispers, the snickers. They all thought Jackson didn't belong, that he was different. Less. Now here was Chris, the man who once muttered slurs when he thought no one could hear, looking at Jackson with desperate, pleading eyes. The sounds of war raged on around them, but time seemed to slow as Jackson weighed his options. He could leave Chris here. The others were moving up ahead. He had the chance to catch up, to find safety without dragging dead weight behind him. After all, Chris had never shown him an ounce of kindness. Why should Jackson save someone who wouldn't have done the same for him? But Jackson's father had raised him better than that. His father, a man who had fought in a different war decades ago, always taught him that character wasn't defined by what others did to you, but by what you did in return. "Do what's right," his father would say. Always, no matter who's watching. Jackson cursed under his breath and looked away for a moment. It wasn't easy to swallow this bitter pill. He didn't owe Chris anything, but something inside wouldn't let him turn his back. Maybe it was his father's voice echoing in his mind, or maybe it was simply who Jackson was. He grabbed Chris under the arms and heaved him up. Chris groaned, the pain evident, but Jackson didn't let it slow him down. He threw Chris's arm over his shoulder and, with gritted teeth, began dragging him toward cover. The bullet still whizzed by, closer now, but Jackson focused on the task at hand, getting them both out of there alive. Chris coughed, a pained sound cutting through the thick air. Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jackson didn't answer. He just kept moving forward, each step heavier than the last. This wasn't about forgiveness. Not yet. It was about doing what had to be done. There would be time for answers later, if they survived. The weight of Chris's body bore down on Jackson as they stumbled through the rubble, each step a battle in itself. The gunfire hadn't let up, but Jackson knew they couldn't stay exposed much longer. The dust in the air choked him, and his legs burned from carrying Chris's limp form. They needed to find shelter. Fast. Jackson's eyes darted around, searching for anything that could serve as cover. Up ahead, he spotted a collapsed building, its skeletal structure offering just enough of a shield from the chaos around them. Without a word, he hoisted Chris higher, forcing his legs to move faster despite the sharp pain shooting up his back. They reached the building, and Jackson lowered Chris against a half-standing wall, both of them panting from the effort. He crouched beside him, eyes still scanning the horizon, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. They were out of the line of fire for now, but danger was never far off. The battle raged on, distant shouts and explosions reminding them that their brief moment of peace could end at any second. Chris winced, clutching his leg. The blood hadn't stopped, and his breathing was shallow, quick. Jackson knew the look of a man in shock. Chris was fading fast. He reached into his pack, pulling out a small medical kit, his fingers moving automatically, performing the motions he'd done 100 times before. As Jackson worked to bandage Chris's leg, he couldn't help but notice how silent Chris had become. The usual sharp edge to his tone, the casual arrogance that often slipped into his words, gone. There was just pain now and something else, something that almost resembled fear. Chris looked down at Jackson's hands, watching him as he tied the bandage tight. "I don't get it," Chris muttered, his voice weak but full of confusion. "After everything, you're still helping me." Jackson didn't pause, his hands steady as they continued the task. He could feel Chris's eyes on him, waiting for an explanation, but Jackson wasn't ready to give one. What was there to say? That this was the right thing to do, that his instincts wouldn't allow him to leave a fellow soldier behind no matter what. Or maybe that, deep down, some part of him wanted to prove something, not to Chris but to himself. Instead, Jackson kept his response simple. "You're hurt, I couldn't leave you out there." Chris flinched slightly as if the words stung. His eyes flicked away, his mouth tightening. "You should've. I deserve that, don't I?" Jackson finished tying the bandage, securing it as tight as he dared without causing more damage. He sat back on his heels, looking Chris in the eye for the first time since they'd gotten off the battlefield. "Doesn't matter what you think you deserve," Jackson replied, his voice calm but firm. "We're soldiers. Out here, it's about surviving. That's all." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them stretched out, thick with unspoken words, past resentments and the reality of the situation they now found themselves in. Jackson wasn't interested in rehashing the past, but he could see the questions swirling in Chris's eyes. The doubt, the shame. Before Chris could respond, the distant sound of approaching vehicles cut through the stillness. Jackson tensed, listening closely. It wasn't the familiar hum of their unit's transport. This was something else, something worse. The enemy was getting closer. Jackson's body tensed as the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. He shifted his weight, peeking around the crumbling wall to get a better view of the road beyond. Dust clouds billowed up from the distance, stirred by the unmistakable rumble of enemy trucks rolling closer. His heart pounded, but his mind stayed sharp. They didn't have much time. Chris, still slumped against the wall, groaned softly as he adjusted his position, wincing at the pain in his leg. Jackson glanced back at him, the lines of tension on his face deepening. Chris's injury was bad, and it wasn't just about stopping the bleeding anymore. If they didn't get him out of here soon, he wouldn't last. The vehicles drew nearer. Jackson could make out the shapes of soldiers, their uniforms not matching his own. The enemy. He had seen them before, creeping through the haze of battle like shadows, ruthless and efficient. If they found Chris and him here, their chances weren't good. Jackson's mind raced. They had two options: wait it out and hope the convoy passed by, or make a run for it and risk being spotted. Neither was a safe bet. He turned to Chris, who had his head resting against the wall, eyes half closed. Sweat beaded on his brow, and his breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. "Chris, listen to me," Jackson said, his voice low but steady. "We've got company coming and they're not friendly. We've got to move." Chris blinked, disoriented, as if he didn't fully comprehend what Jackson was saying. His face was pale, the blood loss clearly taking its toll. He struggled to sit up straighter, wincing with every movement. I can't," Chris rasped, his voice barely audible. "I can't move. You go. Leave me here." Jackson felt a surge of frustration. This wasn't the time for Chris's self-pity or his attempt to play the martyr. He crouched down in front of him, gripping his arm firmly. "You're not dying here, and I'm not leaving you behind," Jackson said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If you stay here, they'll find you, and it'll be worse than anything you can imagine." Chris swallowed, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something else. Shame, maybe, or fear. He shook his head weakly, refusing to meet Jackson's gaze. "Why are you still trying to help me? After everything?" Chris asked again, his voice trembling, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. "I don't deserve it." Jackson clenched his jaw. feeling the pressure of the situation closing in on them. He wanted to snap at Chris to make him understand that now wasn't the time for this, but he couldn't. Instead, he just gave Chris a look, one that said there was no room for arguing. He wasn't going to abandon him no matter what Chris thought he deserved. "Deserves got nothing to do with it," Jackson said quietly. "I'm not leaving you." End of story. The sound of the trucks grew even closer, and Jackson's body tensed again. He heard voices now, the distinct shouts of soldiers ordering each other around. It was only a matter of time before they reached their position. Jackson stood, hoisting Chris up once more, forcing him to lean on him as he struggled to keep them both steady. Chris winced, but he didn't resist this time. They moved slowly, Jackson guiding them around the side of the building, trying to stay out of sight. His eyes darted from corner to corner, scanning for any place that might offer better cover. His mind raced, calculating every risk, every step. If they could just make it to the trees up ahead, maybe they'd have a chance. As they neared the edge of the building, the sound of the trucks came to an abrupt stop. Jackson froze. Chris's body sagged against him, too weak to stand on his own. Jackson tightened his grip, his breath shallow. Then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of boots hitting the ground. The enemy had arrived. Jackson's muscles tightened, and his breath stilled as he pressed his back against the crumbling wall, holding Chris up with one arm while scanning their surroundings. The sound of boots crunching on gravel sent a jolt through his system, heightening his senses. They were close, too close. He could hear the soldiers speaking in low, guttural tones, their language foreign yet unmistakable in its purpose. Chris sagged heavily against Jackson, barely conscious, his weight making it even harder to stay hidden. Every breath Chris took seemed too loud, his labored gasps a potential signal to their enemies. Jackson swallowed hard, forcing his mind to stay clear and focused. He could feel Chris trembling beside him, whether from fear, pain, or both. It was hard to tell. Jackson didn't have time to worry about that. He didn't have time for anything but survival. He glanced around, searching for a way out. His eyes landed on a small gap between the rubble and the twisted remains of a collapsed building. It wasn't much, but it was enough for them to crawl through if they were careful. It might lead them to the other side of the street, out of sight. But they'd have to move silently, and Chris wasn't exactly in the best shape to crawl anywhere. Still, it was the only option. "Chris," Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're going to have to move with me. We're going through that gap up ahead. Stay low and quiet, you hear me?" Chris nodded weakly, his eyes half closed, his body sagging more with every passing second. Jackson could see that he was barely hanging on, but there was no other choice. They had to move, or they'd be found. Slowly, Jackson knelt down, lowering Chris to the ground as gently as possible. Chris groaned softly, his face twisted in pain, but he didn't protest. He knew the stakes, even if his body was betraying him. Jackson took a deep breath and began crawling, his body hugging the ground, pulling Chris along as best as he could. Every movement was a struggle. Chris was barely able to help, his strength drained, leaving Jackson to do most of the work. The dirt and debris scraped against their skin, the sharp edges of broken concrete cutting into Jackson's palms. But he pressed on, ignoring the pain. The voices of the enemy soldiers grew louder, closer. Jackson could hear the shuffle of their feet, the clinking of their weapons. He clenched his jaw and kept moving, inching forward, determined not to be seen. Just a few more feet. His muscles burned with the effort, and sweat dripped into his eyes, blurring his vision. But Jackson didn't stop. He pulled Chris's limp body through the gap, praying that the sound of shifting rubble wouldn't alert the soldiers. Time seemed to slow as every second stretched out painfully, the tension mounting with each breath. Then, a shadow fell over them. Jackson froze, his body going rigid as his heart hammered in his chest. He dared to look up, and his worst fear was confirmed. A soldier stood above them, rifle in hand, scanning the area. For a moment, everything was still. Jackson's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had two options: stay perfectly still and hope the soldier didn't look down, or try to fight. He didn't like his chances with either. Chris let out a faint, involuntary moan, his head lolling to the side, and Jackson's breath caught in his throat. The soldier's eyes snapped toward the noise, his body tensing as he looked down at the ground. Jackson braced himself, his hand twitching toward his sidearm, knowing that any movement now could mean death for both of them. The soldier's gaze swept over the rubble, pausing for a long, agonizing moment as he stared at the spot where Jackson and Chris lay hidden. Jackson's hand tightened around his pistol, ready to do whatever it took, even if it meant giving Chris a few more seconds to live. But then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, the soldier turned away, his boots crunching the dirt beneath him as he continued his patrol. Jackson's body sagged with relief, but he knew it wasn't over yet. They still had to get out of there. Jackson held his breath for what felt like an eternity, his body still as stone, waiting for the sound of the soldier's boots to fade completely. When the crunching gravel finally grew distant, he allowed himself a shallow exhale. His muscles ached from the tension, but he couldn't afford to relax, not yet. They were still in enemy territory, and every second counted. Chris stirred weakly beside him, his face pale and drawn. Jackson could see the exhaustion etched into his features, the pain gnawing at him. Chris's breathing was labored, each inhale more ragged than the last. He wasn't going to last much longer in this condition. Jackson knew they needed to move, fast, but every option seemed like a gamble. Jackson glanced around the narrow alley they'd crawled into. The buildings provided some cover, but the real problem was getting Chris to safety without attracting attention. A soldier in the distance called out to another, and Jackson tensed again, his body instinctively shifting to shield Chris. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him, even as his mind churned with doubt. Why was he still doing this? The question lingered in the back of his mind, the ghost of resentment rising with each labored pull of Chris's body. A man who had shown him nothing but contempt now depended on him for survival. It wasn't fair. Nothing about this situation was fair. Jackson could have left him behind, should have by some twisted logic. But here he was, risking his life for someone who never gave him a second thought, except to insult him. Chris's eyes fluttered open, just barely, and he let out a faint groan. Jackson glanced down at him, tightening his jaw against the surge of frustration that threatened to boil over. Now wasn't the time to let his emotions take control. He wasn't doing this for Chris. He was doing it because it was right, because he was better than the hate Chris had harbored. "We can't stay here," Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant sounds of battle. "I'm going to get us to the trees. Once we make it there, we'll be harder to track." Chris nodded weakly, though Jackson could see that he was barely holding on. His body was limp, drained of any strength, and his leg was still bleeding despite Jackson's earlier attempt to stop it. Jackson cursed under his breath, knowing they were running out of time. He shifted, positioning himself to lift Chris again. Every movement was a struggle, Chris's weight pressing down on him like an anchor, but Jackson's resolve remained steady. He wasn't leaving him behind. Not now. Not after everything. As Jackson hefted Chris to his feet, Chris let out a strangled groan, his eyes screwed shut from the pain. They stumbled forward, Jackson half carrying, half dragging him across the uneven ground. Each step felt like a small victory, even as the looming threat of discovery hung over them like a dark cloud. As they neared the cover of the trees, Jackson's ears picked up the sound of a vehicle rumbling nearby. His pulse quickened. It wasn't just the enemy patrol this time. There was something else, something larger moving toward them. Jackson strained to listen, and then it hit him. It was the sound of one of their own trucks. The cavalry was coming, and they had to make it there before the enemy cut them off. Jackson quickened his pace, his breath coming in harsh gasps as he pushed forward. The trees were so close now, just a few more yards. Chris's weight was nearly unbearable, his body sagging with every step. But Jackson refused to stop. He couldn't. Not when help was so close. Just as they reached the edge of the forest, Jackson caught sight of the transport truck in the distance, bouncing over the rough terrain toward their location. Relief surged through him, but it was quickly followed by a sharp pang of dread. Behind the truck, A small group of enemy soldiers had spotted them, their guns raised, shouts of alarm cutting through the air. Jackson had no choice. "Hold on," he growled, tightening his grip on Chris as he broke into a stumbling run, his legs burning with effort. Bullets whizzed past them, thudding into the ground, but Jackson didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The truck was closing in, and so were the enemy soldiers. Jackson's legs screamed in protest as he dragged Chris, each step feeling heavier than the last. The shouts from the enemy soldiers behind them grew louder, the gunfire more frequent. Dirt kicked up near Jackson's feet as bullets struck the ground, too close for comfort. He clenched his jaw, gritting his teeth against the rising tide of panic. The trees offered some cover, but it wouldn't last. The truck was their only chance now. Chris groaned again, barely conscious, his body hanging limply as Jackson all but carried him. They were so close, but every inch felt like a mile. Jackson's mind raced. How much longer could he keep this up? He'd been running on pure adrenaline, but even that had its limits. The truck, still barreling toward them, honked its horn as it swerved to avoid debris scattered across the rough terrain. Jackson glanced back, his heart leaping as he saw a familiar face at the wheel. Sergeant O'Connor. He had never been so relieved to see anyone in his life. But the enemy soldiers were closing in fast, and Jackson knew they only had seconds before the situation turned deadly. With one final burst of energy, Jackson reached the edge of the road where the truck screeched to a halt, the door flying open. O'Connor jumped out, his rifle at the ready, barking orders to the other soldiers inside the vehicle. "Get them in," O'Connor shouted, eyes scanning the trees for signs of the approaching enemy. Jackson barely registered the words as two other soldiers leaped from the truck and rushed to help him. They grabbed Chris, easing him from Jackson's grasp and lifting him into the back of the truck. Jackson stumbled, his legs nearly giving out beneath him, but O'Connor grabbed his arm, steadying him. "You all right, Jackson?" O'Connor asked, his voice gruff but laced with concern. Jackson nodded, though he could barely catch his breath. "I'm fine, just get him out of here." O'Connor gave a curt nod, motioning for Jackson to get in the truck. But Jackson hesitated, glancing back toward the trees. The enemy was still out there, and it wouldn't take long for them to close the distance. "We've got to move," O'Connor shouted, urgency creeping into his voice. "They're right on top of us." Jackson climbed into the truck, his body aching with exhaustion, and collapsed onto the bench beside Chris. Chris's face was ashen, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. The medics would take care of him now. Jackson leaned back, staring up at the sky as the truck lurched forward, tires spinning in the dirt as they sped away from the battlefield. For a moment, all Jackson could hear was the pounding of his own heart in his ears. The danger wasn't completely over, but for now, they were safe. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of what had just happened settle over him. Chris, lying beside him, stirred weakly, his eyelids fluttering open. His voice was barely a whisper when he spoke. "You saved me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with disbelief and guilt. Jackson opened his eyes, staring up at the canvas roof of the truck. He didn't answer at first, his mind still processing everything that had led them to this point. He didn't know what to say. Chris had made his feelings about him clear from day one, and now here they were, alive, but forever changed. Chris turned his head slightly, his pale face twisted in confusion. "Why?" he croaked, his voice hoarse. Jackson finally looked over at him, meeting his eyes. For the first time since the chaos began, he saw something different in Chris. Something vulnerable, maybe even afraid. Jackson's jaw tightened. "I wasn't gonna let you die out there," Jackson said quietly. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of weariness to it. "I don't care what you've said or done in the past. When it comes down to it, we're still in this together." Chris blinked, clearly grappling with the weight of Jackson's words. His lips parted, as if he wanted to say something more, but the effort was too much. Instead, he closed his eyes, falling back into an uneasy sleep. Jackson let out a long breath, feeling the tension slowly drain from his body. The truck rumbled beneath them, the sound of the battlefield fading into the distance as they drove further away from danger. But Jackson knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. What happened on that battlefield had changed something, but whether it was for the better, only time would tell. The truck jostled along the uneven road, the distant rumble of artillery now fading into the background. Jackson sat in silence, his body slumped against the side of the vehicle as the adrenaline began to wear off. Every muscle in his body ached, and exhaustion was starting to settle in. He stared down at his hands, which were still stained with dirt and Chris's blood, his mind running through everything that had happened in the past few hours. He looked over at Chris, who lay unconscious on the bench beside him. His face was pale, his leg hastily bandaged but still bleeding through in spots. The medics would take care of him once they got back to base. But Jackson knew the physical wounds weren't the only thing Chris would have to face. The others in the truck sat in silence too. They all knew Chris. Some of them had likely heard his comments over the months, the way he talked about Jackson when he thought no one was listening. The truck rumbled on, but the tension inside was thick. Jackson could feel the stares of the other soldiers, even if they didn't say anything. They were probably wondering the same thing Chris had. Why did Jackson save him? O'Connor, sitting across from Jackson, leaned forward slightly, breaking the silence. His weathered face was set in a frown, but his eyes were softer than usual. "That was some risky business back there, Jackson," he said, his voice low but steady. Jackson shrugged, still staring at Chris. Had to be done. O'Connor glanced at Chris's unconscious form and then back at Jackson. "You didn't have to, though. You know that." Jackson finally met O'Connor's gaze. There was no judgment in the sergeant's eyes, just curiosity. Jackson knew what he was getting at, but the truth was even he didn't fully understand his own decision. He wasn't one to hold grudges, but saving a man who had openly despised him wasn't something he'd ever imagined doing. "I did what I had to do," Jackson said, his voice flat, trying to keep the conversation from going deeper than it needed to. "We're soldiers. We don't leave each other behind." O'Connor's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close to it. "That's a hell of a lot more than most would have done in your shoes." Jackson didn't respond. He leaned his head back against the truck, staring up at the canvas roof as it flapped in the wind. He could feel the weight of O'Connor's words, the unspoken respect in them, but he wasn't interested in praise. This wasn't about being noble or about proving something. It was about doing what was right, even when it didn't make sense. The truck jolted as it hit a pothole, and Jackson winced as the sudden movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his legs. His body felt heavy with exhaustion, but his mind refused to rest. The events of the day played on a loop in his head, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between him and Chris, something that couldn't be undone. After a long stretch of silence, the base finally came into view. The truck rolled through the gates and Jackson let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They were safe, at least for now. The medics would take Chris and Jackson could try to get some rest, though he doubted sleep would come easily. As the truck came to a stop, the back doors swung open, and the soldiers inside began to disembark. Medics rushed forward, quickly lifting Chris onto a stretcher and carrying him away. Jackson watched as they hurried toward the field hospital, the weight of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. O'Connor clapped a hand on Jackson's shoulder as he stepped off the truck. "Get some rest, Jackson. You've earned it." Jackson nodded, though he knew rest was the last thing on his mind. As he watched the medics disappear into the hospital tent, he couldn't shake the feeling that this day had set something in motion. Whatever it wasn't going to end here. The air inside the base was heavy with the quiet hum of generators and the distant murmur of soldiers. Jackson stood still for a moment, watching the medics carry Chris's stretcher into the hospital tent, the flap swinging closed behind them. He took a deep breath, trying to push down the gnawing sense of unease that had settled in his gut. He hadn't had time to process everything that had happened, but now, in the stillness of the base, it hit him all at once. What if Chris didn't make it? Despite everything, Jackson had fought to save his life, and now it was out of his hands. It was a strange feeling, this limbo between exhaustion and anticipation. He'd done his part, but something still felt unfinished. Jackson turned away from the hospital tent and started toward the barracks, his legs stiff and aching. His thoughts drifted back to the battlefield. Chris's face when he'd first realized Jackson was there to save him. The shock, the disbelief. Jackson couldn't blame him for that. In Chris's mind, their relationship had been simple. Jackson was someone he looked down on, someone whose existence he barely acknowledged unless it was to make some snide comment. That was the way things were supposed to be in Chris's world. But Jackson had turned that world upside down. As Jackson approached the barracks, a few of his fellow soldiers lingered outside, some cleaning their gear, others chatting in low voices. When they saw him coming, the conversation quieted. The looks were subtle. None of them said a word. But Jackson could feel the weight of their curiosity, their silent questions hanging in the air. He could almost hear them asking themselves why he had saved Chris, of all people. Ignoring the unspoken tension, Jackson made his way inside the barracks. The space was dimly lit, the sharp scent of sweat and gunpowder lingering in the air. Jackson sat heavily on his bunk, the creaking springs protesting under his weight. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, and ran a hand over his face. His mind wouldn't stop racing. It wasn't about Chris. It never had been, Jackson reminded himself. Saving him had been about doing what was right, about rising above the hatred, the petty divisions. In war, none of that mattered. They were all just trying to survive. Still, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was different. Something deeper had shifted, not just in Chris, but in himself as well. The barracks door creaked open and Jackson looked up to see Sergeant O'Connor standing in the doorway. He stepped inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and came to a stop in front of Jackson's bunk. "Chris is stable," O'Connor said, his voice a low rumble. "Medics say he's lost a lot of blood, but he'll pull through. They're patching him up now." Jackson felt a flicker of relief, though it was quickly overshadowed by something else, a sense of inevitability. Chris would live, but now what? What would their next interaction be? How would Chris look him in the eye after this? O'Connor pulled up a stool and sat down across from Jackson, his weathered face lined with exhaustion. "You did good out there," he said, his tone careful. "Most men wouldn't have done what you did, especially not for him." Jackson shrugged, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I just did what anyone would have done." O'Connor raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "No, Jackson, not just anyone would have done that." Jackson didn't respond, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. He didn't want to talk about it, not like this. What was the point? It was over, wasn't it? Chris was alive. That should have been enough. But O'Connor wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Jackson's. "You think this is over, but it's not," O'Connor said quietly. "Whatever's been between you and Chris all this time, saving his life isn't going to erase that. You know that as well as I do." Jackson let out a long breath, nodding slightly. O'Connor was right. The battle may have been over, but something bigger loomed on the horizon, something neither of them could escape. Chris wasn't just any soldier. He was a man whose entire identity had been wrapped in his hatred, in his belief that people like Jackson didn't belong. And now that Jackson had saved him, that belief had been shattered. And when Chris woke up, they'd both have to face it. The following day came slowly, dragging in the weight of exhaustion from the previous night. Jackson had barely slept, his mind spinning with thoughts he couldn't untangle. He had laid in his bunk, staring at the dimly lit ceiling, replaying the events of the battlefield over and over again. The stillness of the barracks was unnerving, contrasting sharply with the chaos that had consumed the day before. When morning finally broke, Jackson decided to check on Chris. He wasn't entirely sure why, but something pulled him in that direction. Perhaps it was unfinished business, or maybe he just needed to see for himself how Chris would handle this new reality. Either way, Jackson found himself heading toward the field hospital. The tent was busy, medics moving quickly between patients, treating wounds that ranged from minor to severe. The sharp smell of antiseptic hung in the air, mixing with the soft groans of soldiers in pain. Jackson walked down the narrow aisle, searching the rows of cots for Chris. He spotted him near the back, lying still, his leg heavily bandaged, his face pale but calmer than before. Chris's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. For a moment, Jackson considered turning around. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this conversation, or if Chris was either. But then, as if sensing him, Chris turned his head slightly and saw Jackson standing there. The tension between them was thick. Chris's expression was hard to read, a mixture of confusion and something else, perhaps guilt or discomfort. Jackson stayed silent, unsure of how to begin. There was no manual for how to navigate this kind of situation, and every word he could think of felt inadequate. "Hey," Chris said, his voice weak but not hostile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jackson took a few steps closer, stopping at the foot of Chris's cot. "Hey," he responded, his tone even. He didn't want to make this any more complicated than it already was. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Chris shifted slightly, wincing at the movement, his hands clenching the blanket that covered him. His eyes avoided Jackson's, focusing somewhere on the wall behind him, as if he couldn't quite bring himself to face the man who had pulled him from the brink of death. Jackson crossed his arms over his chest, finally breaking the silence. "How are you holding up?" Chris swallowed hard, his gaze still averted. "I'm alive. Thanks to you." There it was, an acknowledgement of what had happened. Chris's voice was tight, strained, as though the weight of gratitude was something he wasn't used to carrying. Jackson nodded, though he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. "I don't get it," Chris continued, his words coming out slowly, like he was struggling to find the right ones. "You could have left me out there. Hell, I probably would have left you if things were the other way around." Jackson's jaw tightened at the admission, but he wasn't surprised. Chris had never been subtle about his views, even if most of the time they were delivered in careless mutterings and cold stares. But hearing it said so plainly didn't make it easier to swallow. "I could have," Jackson replied after a pause, "but I didn't." Chris finally looked up, his eyes meeting Jackson's for the first time. There was something raw in his expression, something that Jackson hadn't seen before, a vulnerability Chris had never allowed to surface. It was clear he didn't know how to handle this. The man who had always walked through life with his prejudices intact was now standing at a crossroads he hadn't expected. "Why?" Chris asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Why'd you save me after everything?" Jackson inhaled slowly, his gaze unwavering. He'd asked himself that question a dozen times since the moment he pulled Chris from the battlefield. The truth was, there was no simple answer. It was a combination of instinct, morality, and something deeper, something he hadn't fully unpacked yet. But standing here with Chris looking at him, waiting for an explanation, Jackson didn't have the luxury of sorting through those complexities. "I saved you because it was the right thing to do," Jackson said simply. "We're both out here fighting the same war, facing the same risks. And when it came down to it, I wasn't about to let you die no matter what's happened between us." Chris blinked, his brow furrowing as he processed Jackson's words. For a moment he looked like he might argue, but then he let out a long, weary sigh. "I don't know how to make sense of this," he admitted. I never thought someone like you would." He stopped himself, the words hanging awkwardly in the air. Jackson's expression hardened. He knew what Chris was trying to say, but hearing it still cut deep. Chris's entire worldview had been built on a foundation of disdain for people like Jackson, and now that foundation had cracks in it. Big ones. "You've got some things to figure out," Jackson said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not the one who can help you with that." Chris nodded, his eyes dropping back to the blanket. "Yeah, I guess I do." The weight of everything unsaid lingered between them. Jackson knew this conversation wasn't over. Not really. There were years of hatred, of deep-rooted beliefs that Chris had to wrestle with on his own. Saving his life had been one thing. Changing his mind was another battle entirely. The conversation between them seemed to drift into a quiet standstill. The tension still hung in the air, but now it was accompanied by something else. uncertainty. Chris lay back on the cot, staring at the ceiling, his breathing shallow but steady. Jackson stood at the foot of the bed, unsure if there was anything more to say. The truth was, this wasn't the kind of thing you could fix with a few words, and Jackson knew it. As Jackson turned to leave, Chris spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You think I can ever make this right?" Jackson stopped in his tracks, his back to Chris. The question hung heavy between them, as if Chris were asking more than just about their situation. There was an unspoken plea in his tone, something deeper than just making things right between them. Chris was asking whether there was a way to undo a lifetime of prejudice and hate, whether he could change. Jackson turned back around slowly, his expression unreadable. "That's up to you," he said, his voice calm but direct. "I can't answer that for you. It's not about me, Chris. It's about what you want to do with the rest of your life. You've got to decide who you want to be." Chris's eyes flicked to the side, a muscle in his jaw twitching. He looked uncomfortable, as though the weight of the realization was too much to bear. His hands fidgeted with the blanket, and for a moment, he didn't speak. Jackson could see the struggle in his face. Chris was wrestling with something that had been a part of him for so long that it had become ingrained in his identity. Change wasn't going to come easy, if it came at all. "I don't even know where to start," Chris muttered half to himself. Jackson considered that for a moment. He'd seen plenty of men like Chris in his life, stubborn, closed off, afraid to confront their own biases. Most of them never changed, but every now and then something would shake them up, force them to look at the world through a different lens. Maybe this was Chris's moment, maybe not. "You start by looking in the mirror," Jackson said after a pause. "Ask yourself what kind of man you really want to be. It's not easy, but it's the only way." Chris nodded, though he didn't look up. Jackson wasn't sure if his words had sunk in or if Chris was just too tired to argue anymore. Either way, it wasn't Jackson's fight to wage. He had done what he could. The sound of footsteps approached from behind, and Jackson turned to see one of the medics entering the tent, clipboard in hand. The medic glanced between Jackson and Chris before speaking. "I need to check on him," the medic said, nodding toward Chris. Jackson gave a small nod and stepped aside, feeling the weight of the interaction settle over him as the medic began his work. It wasn't over, not really. There was still a long road ahead for Chris, and Jackson had no idea if the man would ever truly change. But at least the seed had been planted. He left the tent, the sunlight hitting his face as soon as he stepped outside. The base was still buzzing with activity, soldiers moving about their duties, oblivious to the quiet battle Jackson and Chris had just fought inside the tent. As Jackson made his way back toward the barracks, he couldn't help but feel the strange, conflicted mix of emotions rising within him. Had he done enough? Had he really made a difference? Or was Chris just going to go back to being the same person he had always been once the war was over and life returned to normal? Jackson wasn't sure, but he knew one thing for certain. Saving Chris's life had forced them both to confront things they'd spent years ignoring. Whether or not Chris would act on that revelation wasn't something Jackson could control, but he had done his part. As he approached the barracks, O'Connor was sitting outside sharpening his knife on a whetstone. When he saw Jackson coming, he lifted his chin in acknowledgement, a silent invitation to sit down. Jackson took a seat beside him, both men sitting in the quiet afternoon, the rhythmic sound of O'Connor's knife scraping against the stone filling the air. "How's he doing?" O'Connor asked after a long silence, not looking up from his task. "He'll live," Jackson replied, leaning back against the wall. "Physically, anyway." O'Connor nodded knowingly, his eyes still fixed on the knife. "And the rest of it?" Jackson exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "I don't know. I told him what he needs to hear, but it's up to him to figure it out." O'Connor stopped sharpening for a moment and looked over at Jackson. "You did more than most would have. That's all you can do." Jackson didn't respond, but he knew O'Connor was right. The rest was out of his hands now. He could only hope that Chris would come to grips with what had happened and maybe, just maybe, choose a different path. For now, All Jackson could do was keep moving forward. The days that followed felt like a strange blur. Routine crept back into camp life, the rhythm of war pushing everything forward. Patrols, drills, and briefings took over, each soldier focused on surviving the next mission. Jackson kept to his usual tasks, but the weight of his interaction with Chris lingered at the back of his mind, even if no one spoke about it openly. Word had spread through the ranks, though. Jackson noticed the looks. Some were approving nods, others were more questioning, as if they were trying to figure out why he had gone out of his way for someone like Chris. But none of that mattered to Jackson. He had no interest in justifying his actions to anyone. One afternoon, while cleaning his rifle near the edge of camp, Jackson saw Chris walking toward him. He was limping, the bandages on his legs still fresh, but he was moving under his own power. It was the first time Jackson had seen him out of the hospital tent since their conversation, and the sight of him stirred a mixture of emotions, relief, curiosity, and a bit of wariness. Chris slowed as he approached, hesitating before taking a seat on the bench across from Jackson. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jackson continued his work, running the cleaning rod through the barrel of his rifle, his attention divided between the task and Chris's unexpected appearance. "I guess I should have thanked you sooner," Chris said finally, his voice low and uncertain. "For what you did." Jackson paused, glancing up at him briefly before returning to his work. He wasn't looking for thanks, especially not from Chris. He had only done what needed to be done, and no amount of gratitude would change the past between them. "You don't owe me anything," Jackson replied, keeping his tone neutral. "I did what I had to do. That's all." Chris shifted uncomfortably, his eyes focused on the ground. There was a tension in the air, one that neither of them seemed to know how to address. For all of Chris's bravado in the past, now he seemed smaller, more uncertain, as if he were standing on unstable ground. "I know," Chris said, nodding slowly. "But I needed to say it. You could have left me out there, and no one would have blamed you for it. Hell, I wouldn't have blamed you." Jackson stopped cleaning his rifle and set it aside, looking directly at Chris. "What do you want me to say, Chris? That I thought about it? Sure, I did. I'm human. But when it came down to it, I wasn't going to let you die because of what you've said, or what you believe." Chris flinched slightly as if Jackson's words had struck a nerve. His shoulders slumped, and he looked away, clearly struggling to find the right response. "I've been thinking about what you said," Chris muttered, his voice barely audible. "About looking in the mirror, I never saw it like that before." Jackson narrowed his eyes slightly, studying Chris's face. He wasn't sure if Chris was just saying the right things because he felt obligated, or if there was something genuine underneath his words. But something about the way Chris looked at him now, like he was carrying a burden that he didn't fully understand, made Jackson pause. "What are you trying to say, Chris?" Jackson asked quietly, his tone less guarded now. Chris rubbed the back of his neck, his jaw tightening. "I don't know. I don't have the right words for it yet. But what I do know is that the way I've been thinking, the way I've acted, it's wrong. It was easier to blame people, to judge them, than to deal with my own shit. You saving me, that shook me up." Jackson leaned back on the bench, watching Chris closely. He could see the battle playing out in Chris's mind, the conflict between who he had been and who he might become. It wasn't an easy path, and Jackson didn't expect overnight change. But this acknowledgement was something. It was more than he'd ever thought he'd get from Chris. "You've got a long way to go," Jackson said, his voice steady but firm. "One conversation, one moment, isn't going to fix everything. You've got to be willing to change to actually do the work." Chris nodded, his face grim. "I know. I'm not asking for you to forgive me, or to act like everything's fine between us. I just needed you to know that I'm trying to figure it out, and that I'm sorry for everything." Jackson sat there for a long moment, processing Chris's words. He wasn't sure if they would ever be friends, or even if Chris would truly follow through on the change he claimed to want. But this moment, this small step, was a start. And in a world where men like Chris rarely admitted to being wrong, that was something. Jackson stood up, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. He looked at Chris, giving him a nod, not out of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. "Do what you need to do, Chris. I've got nothing else to say." With that, Jackson turned and walked away, leaving Chris sitting on the bench, alone with his thoughts. The next few weeks passed with the usual grind of military life. Missions came and went, and with them the constant noise of war, gunfire, explosions, and the ever-present tension of survival. Jackson kept his focus on the task at hand, throwing himself into his duties. The base became a blur of patrols and briefings, moments of silence punctuated by sudden bursts of action. But through it all, something had shifted. The quiet stares from his fellow soldiers had started to fade. The questions and whispers about why he had saved Chris weren't spoken anymore, at least not in front of him. Jackson preferred it that way. He didn't need anyone's approval for what he'd done. He'd acted out of principle, not for praise or recognition. As for Chris, he had changed in subtle ways. He moved a little slower now, his leg still healing from the wound. But it wasn't just his body that seemed different. He spoke less, and when he did, his words were measured, thoughtful. He no longer surrounded himself with the same group of soldiers who had laughed at his offhand remarks or shared his narrow views. Instead, Chris kept to himself, spending most of his time either in silence or working alongside the rest of the unit without complaint. Jackson didn't go out of his way to speak to Chris. They worked together when necessary, but there was no forced camaraderie, no expectation of anything more than mutual respect on the battlefield. Chris still had a long road ahead of him, and Jackson had no intention of being his guide along that path. Chris would have to walk that on his own. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the base in hues of orange and purple, Jackson found himself back at the edge of the camp, cleaning his rifle in the fading light. The sound of footsteps on gravel made him glance up, and there was Chris again, standing a few feet away. Chris looked hesitant, but his expression wasn't the same as before. There was no confusion, no anger, just a quiet resolve. He stood there for a moment, as if weighing whether to speak, then finally took a step closer. "Mind if I sit?" Chris asked, his tone even. Jackson gestured toward the empty space next to him without a word. Chris sat down, the weight of the unspoken tension between them palpable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the sounds of the camp bustling behind them as soldiers moved through their routines. "I just wanted to say something," Chris began after a long pause. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about looking in the mirror and figuring out who I want to be." Jackson continued cleaning his rifle, not looking up but listening intently. He had no idea where Chris was going with this, but he let him continue. Chris took a deep breath, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I was wrong. About everything. About you. About the way I saw the world. And I don't expect you to forgive me or trust me overnight, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be better. For whatever that's worth." Jackson paused, his hands stilling over the rifle for a moment. He considered Chris's words carefully. The apology wasn't perfect, but it felt genuine. And that, in itself, was something rare. Chris turned toward Jackson, meeting his eyes for the first time since he'd sat down. "You didn't have to save me, I know that. But you did, and it changed something in me. I don't know where I'm going from here, but I'm not the same guy I was before that day. And that's because of you." Jackson stared at Chris for a long moment, searching for any sign of insincerity, but there was none. He could see the struggle in Chris's face, the weight of the words he was trying to express. It wasn't easy for someone like Chris to admit he'd been wrong, let alone to a man he had once looked down on. Jackson leaned back, his body relaxing slightly. He wasn't one for long speeches or drawn-out conversations, and he had no desire to turn this into something more dramatic than it needed to be. But there was something he could offer, something simple. "You don't owe me anything, Chris," Jackson said quietly. "What you do with the rest of your life, that's on you. Just make sure you live up to it." Chris nodded, the relief in his eyes barely concealed. He looked as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders, one that had weighed on him for years without him even realizing it. "Yeah," Chris murmured. "I will." The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was one of quiet understanding. Neither of them needed to say anything more. The past couldn't be erased, but the future was still unwritten, and that was enough for now. After a few more moments, Chris stood up. "Thanks, Jackson, for everything." Jackson nodded, watching as Chris walked away, his limp barely noticeable now. The camp settled into its nightly routine, the sky above them darkening, stars beginning to peek through. Jackson sat there, the weight of the day lifting just slightly. He wasn't sure what the future held for Chris, but he knew that something had changed between them. Maybe not friendship, but a kind of respect. Jackson cleaned the last of his rifle, stood up, and walked back to his bunk. Tomorrow would be another day of missions and war, another day to push forward. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like something had shifted, not just for Chris, but for himself too. The battlefields were still there, but some wars, like the one between Jackson and Chris, didn't need to be fought anymore. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I work hard on these stories, and your support means a lot to me. Thank you for being part of this journey.